the United States wants someone who'll, like Paris, who'll say nice words and be polite and can be invited to Harvard and so on and so forth. But they don't want a guy who's kind of arrogant and crude. This has happened before. Like back in the early 90s, you may recall, under the first Bush administration, the United States threatened to take away Israel's the billions of dollars of loans that they were giving to Israel. And that was a real threat. It's considered anti-Semitic or something. Well, what happened? What happened, in fact, is that the prime minister at the time was Yitzhak Shamir. Yitzhak Shamir is a kind of an Eastern European Jew. He just talked straight. He said, when James Baker, the Secretary of State, would come to Jerusalem, the Shamir would pick that day, to put up a trailer somewhere in the occupied territories and announce, okay, this is a new settlement. No, that's not the way that's not what diplomats like. What they like is Shimon Peres, who was later prime minister. When James Baker shows up, Shimon Peres says, yes, we love you, no more settlements, we're going to do everything you want, and so on. And we love peace and so on. And then 2 days later, after Baker's gone home, they put up a trailer somewhere and announce a new settlement. Of course, the U.S. knows, but you don't want to be insulted to your face, So what we want is the kind of diplomats who won't insult us to our face, but will do exactly what we want when we can pretend we're not looking. That's called statesmanship. And Lieberman isn't that type. I'm so sure they don't like Lieberman.
Professor, several times now in your lecture, you've alluded to shortcomings of the American press. You've alluded to shortcomings of the American press several times now, when you're talking about the situation in Afghanistan and as well as Israel. And I was wondering what you think can be done to get the American press as a whole to be more unbiased and to kind of tell the perspectives of other countries.
That's not just this issue, it's every issue. I mean, the big issue is we own the world. And it's not just the American press, it's the academic world, it's scholarship, commentary, and so on. And we know exactly what we can do about it. I mean, let's go back to the 60s. I mean, let's take the original sin of American society. Why are we here? Okay. Serious question. I mean, when the colonists came, the place was settled. Millions of people here, many of them with advanced civilizations. Okay, they're not here. Or maybe they're off on reservations somewhere. So what happened to them? Well, the founding fathers knew what happened to them. And so, like if you read John Quincy Adams, he sort of laments the fate of that hapless race of Native Americans who we exterminated with such perfidious cruelty. They knew what they were doing. But that's been written out of history. In fact, up to the 1960s, it was even denied by scholarship. I mean, the standard line, even in scholarship, was, well, there's basically nobody here. I mean, a couple of hunter-gatherers who didn't have any territories, had no claim to territory, so therefore we were just civilizing the jungles. That was totally false. But one of the consequences of the activism in the 60s was to set in motion popular forces which undermined that. So the kind of textbooks that were being used in school in the 1960s, I can give you examples if you want, they couldn't appear in the most reactionary part of the country today without people tearing them to shreds. Okay, that's a change in the level of civilization. And it was caused by large-scale popular activism of people your age. And that's one example. It's not that everything's marvelous in that respect, but at least something's recognized. That's a long way to go. And so there's now in Turkey, when Obama was in Turkey, to go back to that, he evaded the question of congressional resolution on the Armenian genocide. Okay, and he was criticized for evading it. He didn't have to evade the question of a congressional resolution on the extermination of the indigenous population and slavery, because there aren't any such resolutions. Okay, we're not civilized enough to recognize our own monstrous crimes going back centuries, let alone recently. But we are willing to debate somebody else's crimes. And it's a pretty severe criticism of our culture and society. And it can be rectified the way these things have been done in the past. And it's very often young people who've done it. I mentioned the 60s, but I don't want to suggest that everything ended then. I mean, like the feminist movement, which probably had more impact on the society than anything else. It was in the 70s. It was kind of an outgrowth of things that were happening in the 60s, but it wasn't there then. I think its roots are kind of interesting. The environmental movement didn't exist at all. One of the most important developments is the solidarity movements of the 1980s. There's never been anything like that in the history of imperialism, where people from the imperial society, lots of them, went to live with the victims, to protect them, to help them. You know, a lot of it was coming out of evangelical churches, rural America. I mean, nobody ever thought to go live in a Vietnamese village to help defend the people because there's a white face that, or maybe help them somehow, or to an Algerian village. I mean, it just had never occurred to anyone in the entire history of imperialism. But in the 1980s, it was a large-scale movement, and now it's spread all over the world. Okay, it's young people, many of them. And it goes on. We know the ways. We just have to, there's no magic keys to this. They just have to be, the options have to be employed.
No, my question follows on your last comment, and it really speaks to the opportunities part of your talk. And of the opportunities you mentioned, I think one was sort of implicit. For many of us, Obama candidate, Obama movement. The movement can become the army. It can also become something other than the army. So there's a struggle for that. The other opportunities you mentioned were on the other side of the world, and you gave several examples. One, the civil society peace movement in Afghanistan, which is really extraordinary. Even more extraordinary in some ways, the revival of a kind of progressive Iraqi nationalism, centered on the oil issue. I'll add a third. In Egypt, you mentioned the extraordinary brutality of that regime. So it's therefore worth noting that the plot to kind of put Iran, an Iranian Arab split, a Shia-Sunni split, is actively resisted by Egyptian civil society, as I'm sure you know, including the Islamist wing of that civil society. And one of the prominent sheikhs took that line. He's sort of an anti-Shia position. He was ostracized by the sheikhs around him, and sort of progressive.
Was this in Alaska?
This knows Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's probably the leading Sunni cleric.
How did the Brotherhood react?
The Brotherhood was a little bit ambivalent, but the spin-offs from the Brotherhood, the kind of independent Islamists, people like Tariq al-Bishri, Kamal al-Majd, Fahmi Huwaidi, these people publicly chastised Qaradawi for taking that position and had an explanation of it very similar to your own. My question is, and there was a sort of a tantalizing hint in your reference to Afghanistan, that is an openness on the part of those movements to the outside world and international connection. You have suggestions. That's what we've not been successful in doing. And it would seem like the Obama movement, rather than Obama candidate, might just be able to do that. What would it look like?